So I started out with a budget recording setup, an old version of Pro Tools, and literally zero knowledge. A friend showed me how to plug the mics into the interface and get the sound to show up in the DAW, but that was about it. I knew nothing else. I would just mic up an instrument and hope for a decent sound, and once it was recorded, the rest was pretty much just balancing the faders and panning. I didn't know EQ or compression at this point, didn't really understand what plugins even were, and certainly didn't have a clue how to edit tracks after the fact. So what I recorded up front was pretty much what I got in the end. Now I wanted to be a professional producer and engineer and get those sounds that I spent hours studying on my favorite records. Truthfully, I thought that making great records would come pretty easily to me because I believed I had some talent and some technical ability. But as I'm sure you found out too, it's not as easy as it seems from the outside. I expected my stuff to sound polished and professional after just a few months of doing this, but it sounded amateur for years as I kept struggling to teach myself. Of course, I had a lot to learn about mic technique, room acoustics, and the huge world of mixing knowledge, but there was one other massive factor limiting my recordings: the performance quality. I could try to control the tone and the miking and other technical factors, but if the drummer couldn't play in time or the singer couldn't sing in tune, I was sunk. I quickly discovered that even if I got some good tones, these performance issues would make everything sound horrible anyways. And even when I happened to get some good players in the studio, the tracks still didn't sound as tight as the records I listened to when I drove home in my car at the end of the day. It's a classic catch-22 that every engineer is faced with. You want to work with better artists, which makes your recording sound better, but you're not going to attract those artists unless you have a good recording portfolio in the first place. And I was totally trapped, dependent on the quality of musicians that came through my door. Now and then I would hear about these things like editing the drums and tuning vocals, but I didn't see any of those buttons in my DAW, and it seemed like this far off, insanely complicated thing. I also didn't go to school, had no one near me to ask, and no one was talking about editing in the audio magazines I bought. So for a while, I assumed that maybe the pros had some mysterious secret techniques for platinum records, but it was just unnecessary or plain impossible for regular people like me. I guess I was just intimidated by the whole topic and had no idea where to start. I used to hate it if a client brought up something about editing or fixing a track after the fact. I'd immediately get defensive and just try to cover up the fact that I simply didn't have a clue how to do it. I avoided editing because it seemed like too big of a mountain to climb with no idea where to even start. Then one day I was working with a band and the guitarist claimed to have a friend who knew how to edit drums and put them perfectly in time with the click, the same way they did on major label records. So I swallowed my pride and I allowed him to come in and give it a shot. I sat there all stressed out while he chopped up my drum tracks and moved them all over the screen. But then I heard the playback and it was like a fog just lifted in front of me. All of a sudden my drum tracks sounded twice as good. Before even touching any plugins or moving the faders. It sounded tight. It got all of our heads bobbing instantly. It sounded like a pro drum track. How could I have not known about this for almost 2 years? I got him to teach me exactly how he edited the drums and vowed to never do another project where I didn't quantize the drums. It was undeniable. The results were just that much better. After that day, my drum tracks were transformed. In fact, within a couple of months, I was working on a full-length record where the drummer couldn't even play to a click track, yet I was able to take his performance and lock it to the grid. It changed the record profoundly for the better, put a smile on every band member's face, and saved some really good songs from being otherwise unlistenable. There was just one problem though. It took forever. So although I could now take any drummer and make them sound like a human metronome, it sometimes took me 2 hours to edit a single song. I was still tediously cutting and moving and fading every drum hit by hand, the same way my friend had shown me. Like always though, the answer came when I got another chance to watch someone else edit drums. This time I saw a big name pro engineer pull up Beat Detective in Pro Tools, click a few buttons, and 10 or 15 minutes later, the whole song was locked to the grid. This was clearly a better workflow than my 2-hour backwards hit-by-hit method, and so again, I set out to master tools like Beat Detective to do the work for me. After lots of trial and error and hundreds of hours of practice, that 2-hour process was down to as little as 15 minutes. At the same time, I was learning how to clean up the bass and guitars and diving deep into tuning vocals. Each new tip and technique I learned just opened up another possibility to go even deeper. And before long, I wasn't just tuning vocals, but tweaking the timing and lining up perfect harmonies and doubles. And eventually, pulling off flawless sounding recordings even when a band member couldn't play what they wrote. But here's why all of this matters. Because now, the quality of record that I produced was in my hands, no longer dictated by whether the client was a beginner or an expert player. I could now make every single project sound like a clean, polished, professional record, and the bigger clients I was after started noticing. This is how I built a solid discography and got to work with bands like Hopeless, Solid State, Universal, and Distort. And I can say with 100% certainty that without mastering these editing tools, many of the records I made that fans enjoy around the world today would not have gotten noticed at all. My name's Jordan Valerian, and I want to help you take control of your engineering career right now by revealing these editing secrets and letting you see how it's done at the highest levels. Whether you have no idea where to start when it comes to quantizing drums or tuning vocals, or you're sick of spending way too long on boring, tedious processes, or you've got a grasp on editing but end up with fake and robotic sounding tracks, this is for you. Just opt in below to get started, and I'll show you how to get tracks that are incredibly tight yet perfectly natural sounding, while also doing it much faster and saving time. See you on the other side.